from
Is there anything
so when he was here and then got transferred to New York. And then so when they retired,
That's an amazing question.
they were kind of full-time Army in it, and then they left.
It might be
They
somewhat
got really close with them.
particular.
They moved there to like hang out with them, which was really nice for them
I would
for a long
imagine
time.
it's
But
generally the same.
All right, so good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us here on another Wednesday night. This is kind of a challenging time of year just to get everyone together, and so thanks for joining us. Feels like we've been hit and miss here for the last few weeks. We had the week off for Thanksgiving, and then a snow day the next week, and then last week we should have canceled. So for those of you that ventured out, thank you. It was too late to make the call last week. So in retrospect, we should have canceled. So thank you for the 4 of you that were here. And
That's funny.
we had more than that. So this is our last one before Christmas break, of course. So no class next week, the 25th. No class the following week, the 1st. And that means we'll be back together on January 8th. So enjoy the next 2 weeks with your family, and I hope it's refreshing, and I hope you have some sweet time, some downtime. Thank you too for all the well wishes on Sunday night. Very, very kind of you and our church family, and thanks for the cards and all those wonderful expressions. We're very, very thankful for 20 years here, and whoever did Sunday night, we were surprised. So nice job keeping it a secret. So that was great. We are excited to go to Switzerland in the summer. We have a trip planned already there with our seminary, and it's the 20-year anniversary of our seminary. So our annual summit is going to be there in Geneva, Switzerland, and that's paid for by the seminary. And now we're going to tack on another week and hopefully hike the Alps. So that's our plan. So all that to say thank you very much, and we're grateful. So tonight is a theology of work, and then we're going to come back after the break, and we're going to talk about the idols of comfort and ease. So we're just kind of grabbing some topics and taking a few weeks. So 3 weeks on discipleship, 3 weeks on emotions. Then I think we did 4 weeks on relationships. We're going to deal with the topic of work tonight, and then the related issue, the idols of comfort and ease, on January 8th. And then I think what we're going to do after that is 3 weeks on suffering. And I want to do it by looking at the book of Habakkuk. So probably not a book you think of or read much, but I think I want to take 3 weeks on the book of Habakkuk and just kind of walk through that. It's probably one of the best books in the scriptures to be able to think through that issue and God's sovereignty in our suffering. So that's the plan for the next few weeks. Questions? If you were not here last week, which many of you weren't, there are notes on biblical friendship up there, so you can grab those on your way out. So let me pray and we'll talk. Lord, thank you for this evening. Thank you for each person that's here, and thank you for the opportunity once again to meet together, to study your word, to dig into truth. And we ask that as we examine this topic of work, that you will help us to understand these things so that we can be the people that you want us to be in the various vocations and responsibilities you've given us. So we pray that these truths will impress deeply upon our hearts, and that you'd be pleased and honored as we meet together tonight. So we commit this time together to you in your name. Amen. Okay, so we want to address a theology of work tonight. And you say, why would you pick this topic? Well, this is something every single one of you are engaged in. So I want you to think not just narrow 9-to-5 job, employed by someone. I want you to think broader than that. Every single one of you here tonight has some sort of vocational responsibilities. You have tasks and things that the Lord has entrusted to you, whether it's in a job setting or whether it's in your home or whether it's in the church or whatever it is. You all have responsibilities. And so I don't want us just to get locked into well, I don't have a job, so this doesn't pertain to me. So don't think that way. Think broader than that. Each one of us has something the Lord has entrusted to us, work He wants us to do. Whether it's relational work, or whether it's church work, or whether it's work in your home, or work in your family, or in an actual job position. So this is a principle that affects really all of us in our life. And so I want us to think about that. So let's dive into these notes. First of all, as you know, much of your life is going to be spent working. It's been estimated a third of your life will be spent working. The average person will work 9,000 days in your life. That is a long time. So that's a significant portion of our life. Usually 8 to 10 hours of your 16 waking hours, 5 to 6 days per week are spent doing some sort of work. And again, it could be just the work that the Lord's given you outside of a normal employment. But that's significant. And all of us have work that the Lord has given us to do. And a lot of people, some people think that work is a result, or work is a curse, that it is something that's just evil that we have to tolerate as part of life on this fallen planet. Some people have said it's a 4-letter word, which actually it is. It is a 4-letter word, but when they're thinking about it, they're thinking it kind of a curse word. And that's not obviously the case. Many work during the week for the primary purpose of resting on the weekends rather than resting on the weekends in order to work during the week. So this is a shift in our mentality. A lot of people just gut it out from Monday to Friday so that they can live really how they want to live on the weekends and just endure the work week. When in reality, the way we should think about this is in the quotes there, the parentheses, we rest on the weekends so that we can work during the week. And I would just ask you, is that how you think about your work? Whatever the work is the Lord has given you to do, is that how you think about it? You get to rest on the weekends so that you can work during the week. Or is it the opposite, where you're just trying to gut it out to get to Friday, and then you can really do what you want to do? So it's a perspective shift, and so we want to shift it to that latter one. This whole idea of work being a curse is reflected in some of these sayings. I owe, so off to work I go. Some have said hard work never killed anybody, but why take a chance? Maybe you can relate. Someone says, I like work, it fascinates me, I can sit and look at it for hours. And maybe more realistic, hard work spotlights the character of people. Some turn up their sleeves, some turn up their noses, some don't turn up at all. And that is the reality for some of us. So how do you perceive work? How do you think about whether you have a vocation at an actual job or whether it's just the responsibilities the Lord has given you? How do you think about it? Do you look at it as a curse? Or do you look at it as an opportunity? And so this is a critical topic. Some quotes here in the middle of page 1. Millions of people regard their work as something they must bear, a living indignity. A dark cloud of dissatisfaction blankets today's workforce. Only 1/10 of American workers say they are satisfied with their jobs. For the overwhelming majority, work is dull and meaningless. Others have said the work week is to be endured, with temporary reprieves coming on the weekends and vacations and the fleeting years of retirement. Few among us find fulfillment, let alone dignity, in work. So let me just ask you, do you find fulfillment of some sort, or do you see work as a dignity, as a good thing, as a gift from the Lord? And again, the perspective you have is critical in all of this. This leads to many wrong attitudes. Some people just work for pay, some people work for pride, some people work for power. And you can just kind of think about each one of those. Some people, all they're working for is the money. They just want the cash and build their bank accounts. They're driven by greed and materialism. Some people do it because they find their identity in it. Like their whole purpose in life is wrapped up in that position, their job, their status, their name, their accomplishments, their promotions. And for many people, this is why they work. It's a desire to become somebody. I was just reading in a book this week, someone was fearful of dying not because of where they would go or the fact that their life is over, but that they wouldn't be able to work anymore. That's someone who's wrapped up totally in their work. I've never had that thought in my life. I've had other thoughts about dying, but not that one. But that just shows you that for some people, it's their entire identity. And then others work because they want the power, they want the control. It's an ego issue for them. And so all of those would be wrong attitudes associated with work. And when we get into those kinds of ways of thinking, there are two extremes that have to be addressed towards the bottom of page 1 here. One extreme is sloth, laziness, idleness, and undervaluing work. And on the other hand, there's overwork, workaholism, which is not really a disease or disorder, but you get the idea, idolatry, and overvaluing work on the other hand. So these are the unhealthy extremes that we can swing between. On one hand, being just so apathetic and so lazy that we don't do what God has called us to do. On the other hand, finding our identity in it, overwork, idolatry, and those types of things. So for all of those reasons, this is an important topic. This is something that I think we need to address. It's worth considering because for most of us in this room, you're engaged in some sort of labor, some sort of work. And do you have a biblical perspective on that? So just any thoughts in introduction here about the nature of work, why people struggle with this, even some of the challenges with having the right attitudes. Go ahead, Bill.
I never thought about it before until I heard Bodie Bacham comment on it, but work was instituted before the fall.
Yes.
So I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that here in just a moment. Work did not come after Genesis 3. Work came in Genesis 1 and 2. And, by the way, Revelation 22, bookends of the scripture, there's work in Revelation 22. So what does that tell you about the dignity of work? He designed it that way, and in the new heavens, in the new earth, sorry to burst your bubble here, but you're going to be working in the new heavens and the new earth as well. So get used to it. What?
Just won't be tired.
You won't be tired. Yeah. And there won't be problems with people and coworkers and bosses and all of that stuff. So. And thistles and thorns, exactly. So you're exactly right, Bill. Many people have suggested that work came as a result of the fall, which clearly that's not the case at all. So other thoughts? Just by, yeah, Gary.
I guess the way I looked at it, I agreed because Adam had to work in the garden and everything else. But didn't the toil come after the fall?
That is true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I interpreted that. The bad part of work came after that. So.
That's well said. Yeah. So work itself was ordained by God, but the toil, the hardship, the difficulty, that did come as a result of the fall.
Yeah, and I did, of course I struggle with this as a new believer. I look at my job as ministry because I deal with a lot of people.
Sure.
But I read the epistles, and there's many places in there where, hey, don't sit there and do nothing. When they put you up, go work for it. Go earn what you keep. Go do what you have to do. So
exactly.
That points out to me that it never stops. You are, no matter what you're doing, you're working.
Yeah.
Even when you're retired, you're working.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to look at some of those New Testament epistles. Yeah, Lauren.
I was thinking on the second point about pride, I think that the things that you mentioned in that line can really be a struggle. I think I'm a stay-at-home mom, so thinking about stay-at-home moms, like thinking about what you can find your identity in it, and then you can also want to be recognized and affirmed in what we do, and a lot of times discouragement comes because you don't feel recognized or affirmed. You're like, man, everything I do is like really hidden, or no one's seeing what I'm doing the same thing over and over and over again, and the kids, it's just like you feel like you're stuck in this like endless cycle. But even I've never quite thought of it even just as a pride and a desire to want to have that a sense of self-fulfillment and a sense of importance. And so sometimes it feels very there's that struggle of doing work that isn't really seen by outsiders or a lot of adults.
Yeah.
And how that's something to really press into, because there is kind of a pride there of wanting to be recognized, and taking something that is good and worthy, but not because you're gonna get the results that you always want, but because it's where the Lord has placed you.
Yeah.
And so not even trying to find your identity in it, because it's like if you're expecting young children to complete you or to give you a sense of identity,
Not
like
gonna
that's
happen.
really gonna be disappointing. and so seeing it, stepping back and seeing it more as like, this is work that the Lord has given me to do,
Yeah.
and not something that I can't squeeze the meaning out of my kids or what other people think about what I'm doing.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, really well said. And your satisfaction and joy in that work is going to have to come from knowing that you're pleasing the Lord. You're not going to have children run up to you and say, you're the best mom. I mean, they might say that, but they're not going to give you all the accolades that you're going to find perhaps in an office setting or whatever. So your satisfaction, your joy, your sense of fulfillment is going to have to come from, I'm doing what the Lord has called me to do. I'm doing it unto Him for His glory. And yeah.
And some of the actual duties you're doing, you don't necessarily enjoy. Like,
No.
I don't feel like my temperament or personality was organically in some ways cut out to be super domestic in a lot of ways. And so that's been something that I
Sure.
feel like the Lord's had to like help me cultivate and find ways to use the way He's made me in my home. But to also find joy and meaning and purpose in working in my home,
Yeah.
and it not being something that I begrudge or that I'm a victim of, because I'm not
Yeah.
a victim of it.
Yeah, well said.
There was a book, there's a guy named Carl Truan, and I'm sure you've heard of him. He wrote a book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self.
Yeah.
In that book, he looks at how we view ourselves today, kind of like the water we swim in or the air we breathe. But he was talking about how back in his grandfather's time, let's say 100 years ago, work was more about, I have an obligation to my wife and my kids. I have to do this obligation. It was all about that. Whereas today, it's all about self-actualization.
Mhm.
Like if I don't feel fulfilled, then I shouldn't, as if like it's just interesting that sea change where now, I think, I like how you put it, like we have an obligation to please God and then find fulfillment in that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, we're swimming in a culture of, what was the word you used, self-actualization. I mean, it's got to do something for me. It's got to fulfill some objective for me. And if I don't like that, then I'm going to go find another job. And some people are on this quest for finding that thing that's going to give them that sense of fulfillment. And obviously, there's a sense in which we should enjoy to some degree what the Lord has called us to do. But at the same time, at the end of the day, who are we seeking to please? Not self, not a boss. We're seeking to please the Lord. And we're going to talk in a little bit here about the Puritan work ethic. And one of the things the Protestant work ethic involves is this sense of calling, vocation. Like, the Lord has called me to do this. He's equipped me to do this. He's ordained this for me to accomplish. And so it's not ultimately about me, though. It's about, I want to be faithful to Him and what He's given me to do. So you're going to have to fight that in our culture. I appreciate you bringing that up, Pete. You're going to have to fight this whole drift in our culture, too. It's all about you. It's all about your satisfaction. It's all about your getting something out of it. And that's just something we're going to have to fight. So, yeah. Okay.
With your broad definition of work, because there's hobbies that I enjoy that are, some people would consider work. Like I enjoy detailing cars. That's relaxing to me. It's fun. Is that?
I have a
is that
car that
work?
needs to be detailed, so.
I like shoveling snow. Do you think about that as work, or do you think about that as a recreational activity? You enjoy hiking, which some people would be like, man, that's terrible.
Yeah.
Are we talking about that as work as well, or are we talking about just work as in the stuff that we kind of don't always enjoy?
I think I have in mind here more the idea of obligations and responsibilities the Lord has given us to accomplish for His purposes in this life. So we probably don't have within this definition hobbies or things that you just get to do in free time. I think that falls probably outside the purview of what, I mean, there's probably some overlap, but I think what we have in mind here are these sense of responsibilities, obligations, tasks, vocation. Maybe that's the best way to summarize the vocation that the Lord has given you to do in this life. So does that help? Yeah, I think it would largely exclude some of those things. It doesn't mean those things are wrong. Go do those things. I mean, Ecclesiastes, go shovel snow to the glory of God. Go hike to the glory of God. Go, whatever you enjoy doing, do that to the glory of God as a sense of the enjoyment that the Lord has given us in life under the sun. But I think it's probably a little more narrow when we're talking about work and vocation. Yeah. Okay. All right, well, let's come to some theology of work. And what I have on pages basically 2 to 8, I think, are some theological principles that need to undergird the way that we think about work. So what I did is I just kind of started in Genesis and started to think through the scriptures from beginning to end, and some of those key principles and key points in specific texts that really frame up a biblical understanding of work. So let's begin right at the beginning, where God models for us work. He models a commitment to work. So before we say work is bad, work is evil, work is always not enjoyable, we have to say, wait, God started this whole thing with work. God Himself worked. And of course, He was busy those 6 days of creation, initially working, separating, creating, making, and blessing. So clearly, there's nothing wrong with work in and of itself. God is a God who has worked. He's worked for 6 days. He's rested on the seventh day. You can see Genesis 2. We know that. Creation is complete after 6 days. The seventh day He sets apart as holy. He sanctifies it. He rested on the seventh day from all of His work. And by the way, this is the first time in Scripture that anything is said to be holy. Think about that. The very first time something is described as holy is the day of rest that God took when He ceased from His labors. So we have this model that God has laid down for us. Of course, He didn't rest because He was tired or weary. God, of course, is never weary. He's never tired. You can see those verses in the middle of page 2. But He rested in order to enjoy what He made. He finished His work. He did what He was designed for this world. He finishes that work, and like a master craftsman, He stops to admire and reflect on His finished work. If you've ever made anything, I think you can get a small glimpse into what this must have been like. If you've built something out of wood, or you've knitted something, or you've created something in your kitchen, or whatever. Just think about something that you've made, and there's a sense of satisfaction there. You can look at that and say, I did that, I built that, I made that. And I think that's kind of a sense in which God must have had that to a degree when He rests and looks back on everything that He's made. So God has ceased from His labors of creation, but bottom of page 2, He still continues to work today. Jesus says in John 5:17, "My Father is working until now, and I myself am working." So He has ceased from His creative efforts, but He's still working. He's upholding, He's orchestrating, He's sovereignly in control, He's directing, He's providentially designing and working all things after the counsel of His will. So in that sense, God is still at work. But why is it important for us to start here? Bottom of page 2, God rested to establish a pattern for us to follow for our work week. Now, I know you know this, but you work for 5 or 6 days, and then you are to rest for one of those days so you can be refreshed for another 6 days of labor. This is the model that God has given to us. He has laid down a pattern for us, 6 days of labor, 1 day of rest. And the very bottom of page 2, clearly then our work week is based on God's week of creating, which, by the way, is a solid argument for the days of Genesis being 24-hour days rather than millions of years. So if you want some arguments for how we know that those days in Genesis 1 are 24-hour periods and not millions of years, just look at your work week. You don't work for 6 million years and then rest for 1 million. I mean, some days it feels like that. You're working for 6 million years. But notice the model here, the whole pattern, Exodus 20, verse 11, 4 and 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore God blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. So this is a whole other topic. How do we know that evolution is not real? Well, just look at your days of work and the day you're supposed to take off and those types of things. That is a solid argument for the fact that those days were 24-hour days. So there's this example that the Lord has given to us. You work 6, you rest 1. And so top of page 3, if that's the case, then work is not bad in and of itself. Work is blessed by God. It's ordained by God. It's something that He Himself has done. And we don't have time today to talk about the Sabbath, but that Sabbath day of rest became a sign of the Mosaic covenant. And we obviously today don't keep that anymore. We're not under that covenant. We're not Israel. Christ fulfilled that covenant. He's the end of the law. We're not under the Mosaic legislation anymore. So technically, we don't keep the Sabbath in the same way that the Old Testament saints did. So we're not locked into this day of rest where you cannot do anything, and I don't think that that's the case. I grew up in Hudsonville, and when I grew up in Hudsonville, you couldn't cut your grass on Sundays. You couldn't wash your car on Sundays. Restaurants were not open on Sundays. And so there was this emphasis that you had to keep that day. And I appreciate the sentiment. I do think that there is a sense in which we do need to still have a day of rest. So I'm not given a license just to go do whatever you want. But at the same time, we're not locked into that Sabbath rest as they were in the Old Testament. So, thoughts on this whole idea that God works, giving us a model for work. All of that argues for the fact that work in and of itself is not a bad thing. Right? So that's principle number 1. Thoughts, questions? Number 2, then on page 3, work then must be designed by God as something good. It was initially something that was part of God's good and perfect creation. Remember, each day, at the end of each day, God says, and it's good, and it's good, and it's good, and it's good. And it gets to the end of the 6th day, after creating everything, including man and woman, He says, now it's very good. So clearly, the fact that work was a part of that original perfect creation proves that it's a good thing. So just for a moment, think about this. Your work, whatever work you have to do, is a good thing. It's blessed by the Lord. It's not to be viewed as a curse. It's not to be viewed as this horrible chore that you just have to endure until you get to retirement, and then you can really do what you want to do. I get some of that, and I love my vacations, and I love the weekends and those kinds of things, but at the same time, we have to be careful that we don't begin to look at the work the Lord has given to us with a bad attitude, or that it's some sort of curse that we just have to endure. No, God created work to be good, even in a perfect environment. So think about that. It's perfect. There's no sin yet. Genesis 1-2, there's no sin. The fall hasn't happened. There's Adam. He communicated to Eve this whole aspect that they needed to understand. So it's a perfect environment. And work is a part of that. How do you know that? Genesis 2:5, there was no man to cultivate the ground. So God creates man. Genesis 2:15, He takes the man and puts him into the garden to cultivate it and keep it. Right? So this is all pre-fall. So this is a good thing. This is all part of the original good creation. God designed work. He gave Adam work to do, cultivating, keeping, overseeing, and we'll look at more in just a minute. You gonna say something? Were you gonna say something, Pete?
Or, just as a reminder that sometimes we think our job is useless, but if we're being paid for it, it's not useless. Somebody needs it, there's a need for it.
Yeah.
And I forgot what else I was gonna say, but it's just good to remember that. But we're serving mankind, we're serving our fellow humans. by
Absolutely.
working. If we weren't getting paid for it, then maybe it wouldn't be worth it, but it's just good to remember.
Someone needs it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
absolutely. And even if you're not getting paid for it, if someone needs your service, your oversight, your skill, your whatever, to fulfill that responsibility, it's still valuable and it's still important. So part of being made in the image of God is this task of labor. So let's think for just a moment about what does it mean to be made in the image of God? Well, there's a relational element. God is relational, we're relational. There's a spiritual element. God is spiritual, we're spiritual. There's an eternal element. God is eternal. He's created us, although with a beginning, we are then eternal after that point. So there's a social aspect to this. So all of this has the idea of being made in the image of God. But there's another component to being made in the image of God, and it's work. So look at Genesis 1:26-28. He says, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. And then notice the work that he designed for Adam to do, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. So here's this idea of the Imago Dei once again. And notice in the context of this whole idea of the image of God being represented in the creation of man and woman, he has this idea of work. Verse 28, God blessed them. God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And then notice, subdue it and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So this is known as the creation mandate. Adam and Eve were to reproduce, and in the process of that, they were to have children who were to have children who were then to exercise dominion over God's creation. So baked into the creation mandate is work. Again, pre-fall, and so we have this idea then that it's not a bad thing. Bottom of page 3, we're entrusted with a unique privilege, the privilege of ruling over everything he put on earth. Man is to shape creation by way of his work in such a way as to reflect the beauty, the order, and the glory of the Creator. So stop right there. Think about that. Why does God create Adam and Eve in his image and charge them with dominion over his creation? They are essentially his vice regents. Why? So that they can reflect him and model him and show him off. So it's really about his glory, his power, his goodness. Adam is to represent God's authority to a world over which he has given dominion. So towards the bottom there, our work matters. Being made in the image of God brings dignity to our work. So let me just stop right there. If you think you're in a dead-end job, if you think you're in a nothing job, if you think this is not important, if you think this is dumb, this is worthless, there's no satisfaction here, well, just remember, God has designed you temporarily, at least for the time being, for you to do that work, and there's dignity associated with it. So it's not just this dead-end, empty, futile thing. Your work matters to God. Very bottom of the page, our job has inherent purpose and meaning because God is the author of work, and more important than what we do is why we do it and who we do it for. That's critical. Okay, more important than what you do. You could change another job, you can go to another position, you can be hired by another company, that's all within your prerogative. But within all of that, what's most important is why you're doing what you're doing and who you're doing it for. So in that sense, it doesn't matter what you're doing. Whether you're a stay-at-home mom or whether you're a stay-at-home dad or whether you're an employee in a factory, or whether you're leading as a CEO of a corporation or a lawyer, it doesn't matter. Why you do what you do and who you do it for is more important. Rachel?
So in that vein, purpose and meaning, I mean, there's some more controversial jobs in 2024 that I've wrestled with, as far as like someone who's a YouTube influencer who just, you know.
Is this
makes-
something you were thinking of pursuing?
For a hot second, maybe. Being a podcaster. I mean, there's people now who in this digital age, like, they make their money through
Yeah.
social media influencers. I mean,
Sure.
these women make millions of dollars just by telling people what to buy. And people who sit on YouTube all day make money by monetizing their content. And so I have wrestled a bit with, like, is the Lord pleased with every type of work we do, or is it there's certain, like, surely, like, you know, someone like who's literally makes a living in as a gangster or even a sex worker, I feel like that would not be in the category of
Correct.
honoring the Lord with your.
Correct.
But those are jobs. So I just wanted to maybe clarify: is there a difference between jobs that have meaning and purpose and jobs that don't?
Very good question. Obviously, you have to set some boundaries around these things. There are jobs that are rooted in sin. The examples you just gave, I think we would have to say God is not pleased by that. That is the kind of work that is clearly prohibited in Scripture. We can go to book, chapter, and verse on the violence, on harming people, on sex outside marriage. I mean, all of that is clearly prohibited in Scripture. So we have to say that there's work that falls outside of the parameters of biblical principles that is not honoring to the Lord. But now, even when you say that, now there's probably a gradation of how you gauge what is biblically appropriate. And some of that's going to come down to a conscience issue, I think, for someone. Like, can a Christian work in an abortion clinic? I don't think a Christian should work in an abortion clinic. I think that should be a clear violation of conscience. But could a believer work in a beer factory? I don't know. I think you have to wrestle with that. You're producing a product that can lead to drunkenness and those kinds of things. So, but is there a book, chapter, verse that says, "Thou shalt not work at Budweiser"? I'm not sure you could establish that fact, but I think there are jobs then that you're going to have to wrestle through those kinds of things. And then there's jobs where clearly there's no clear violation of biblical principle, but even in that, you might be doing it for the wrong motive, for the wrong reasons, for the wrong purpose. So even in the jobs that would fall within biblical acceptable positions, you can still do it for the wrong motive. So I don't know. I'm just thinking off the cuff right now, but does that help at all?
Yeah, I also have another friend I just thought of too, who got involved in the stock market exchange, and so he's trying to essentially, what it sounds like to me, I could be wrong, is by moving his money around like all the time, he's just working the stock market to make money.
Yeah.
And so I just thinking about, like, is he actually working, or is he just smart with like the stock market and just constantly trying to change, his money around so that it's naturally growing on its own.
Yeah.
But he's just sitting at a computer all day. I don't know.
I mean, work is work, and I think the motive is key there. Is this a get rich, I want more cash, I want to become a million, a billion, whatever. Is that what's driving it, or is he just savvy? And sometimes God has built people to be just savvy, and they're good at those kinds of things. And if the motives are pure, could we say that is wrong or sinful? I'm not sure we could say that with definitiveness. So, yeah, Dan.
Is it wrong or evil to do a bad job? Can you please God by doing a bad job? Even if you've got pure motives, but objectively the work you produce is no good.
Yeah.
You're just not suited to it. Is that appropriate, or would it be better to move towards work that you are actually more suited to?
Are you talking about someone they're trying hard and they really want to do well at this, but they're just They're incompetent. Let's just face it. This is not suited for you. Are you talking about that kind of scenario, or someone who says, "This is the job I have, but frankly, I don't give a rip about it. I'm just going to put my time in and do the bare minimum to get by." So, which scenario are you talking about?
Well, I think potentially either one,
Yeah.
but you'd be, I think as you're drawing towards, you'd be dealing with different things in different places.
Correct.
I think what I'm kind of thinking about is, especially with this point, work is designed by God as something good. It's good for a hammer to be a really good hammer. It's
Yes.
really good for a human to be a really good human and to be really useful as a human.
Yes.
It's good for a plumber to plumb and plumb well.
Yes.
It's not so good to use a screwdriver as a hammer, right?
Correct.
One thing to think about on that is, if a person's doing a bad job, he'll be fired, or nobody's gonna keep under somebody they're losing more money than they're getting from that employee. In other words, so that's one way he can tell, it's my job, am I doing something that's actually worth anything? He's not gonna keep his job for very long. You won't have to make that decision, it'll be made for him.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah, I think to your point, in either scenario, in the latter scenario I gave, some guy who's just a slacker, I think that's a character issue. That is a sinful character issue, and if that's a believer, that believer needs to repent of just doing the bare minimum, or even doing a horrible job, knowingly doing a horrible job. That's not how we act as believers. I think as believers, we ought to be the best employees, or we ought to be the best moms, dads, whatever it is. I think we ought to be not that it means you're the best at it, but your attitude is the best. Your attempts at doing well, you want to honor the Lord. You're the best employee because you're a believer. So if someone's not doing that, that's a character problem. In the former scenario, someone's just not suited for that job. To Pete's point, they may not last long. But I do think you want to think about, how has God put you together? So part of determining a vocation is, number one, interest, desires. That's got to be a factor. Number two, it has to be giftedness, talents, abilities. How has God wired you? Then, in addition to those things, you're going to look at, what are people saying about you? There's wisdom in a multitude of counselors. So what do people say you're good at? And then fourthly, I would say, what are the objective opportunities God is bringing your way, right? So all four of those go into that equation of, where should I labor? And if you're not naturally or even supernaturally suited to a certain job, I would say it's appropriate for you to consider something else. It's not wrong to switch jobs, but you want to be in your sweet spot, because when you're in your sweet spot, you can maximize your usefulness to that company, but also to the Lord in doing so. So is that getting at what you're getting at?
I think you're speaking about today and the United States and the culture we live in now. Because if you go to third world countries, or you grew up in the Great Depression, any job was a good job.
Yeah.
And it didn't matter what talent you had or anything, you were just thankful
To have money,
to have work.
income.
But we're in a different place. And I think sometimes we can err on my talents and all that almost a little bit too much today, because we have it good, we have it cushy, we can make those decisions, but history hasn't always been that way.
Well said.
And other countries, it's not always.
Well said. Which gets to a little bit what Pete was talking about, the self-actualization thing, and I got to find some fulfillment. And sometimes, 1 Timothy 5:8, if you don't provide for your family, you're worse than an unbeliever. So sometimes you just need to be faithful and fulfill a job, even if you're maybe not best suited for it, so that you can provide for your family, honor the Lord. So there's a lot of dynamics, I think, that go into this. So, Tom, were you going to say something? Do you have your hand up?
Yeah, Christine got most of it. But as men, I think our duty is to provide for our family, like you mentioned. And we might have to do a lot of things we don't like to do.
Yeah.
And it really doesn't matter. My dad worked at jobs he didn't like to do
Right.
a lot.
Right.
But he made the best out of his evenings and his weekends to make a happy family.
Yeah.
And I think we get as a country, we're too wrapped up in, I gotta like my job.
Yeah.
You know, that's
Sometimes you just have to take a job to fulfill the obligations and responsibilities God has given you. Yeah. Lauren?
Should you think about jobs, I'm thinking about like your job, or like a job like where you're more kind of, it's a job that's in ministry, but that's your full-time job, and I agree with what's being said and all that, but I'm also trying to figure like how does that work because if you weren't good at preaching, I don't think that it would go super well. Like after a while, if it was like, you know what, that might not be your skill set, or like I think that would show itself in time. But I'm just wondering, like, how do you, depending on what type of job or what type of calling, I know being a pastor, obviously, I think there are some differences obviously to that versus like, do I go work, at Starbucks or something? But
Yeah.
Just how do you, it does seem like with some type of jobs, you almost have to maybe consider more how you're made or what you feel compelled to do. And I don't know how you rightly think about that in a ministry job versus like an engineering job, or you know what I mean? Or like,
yeah, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but sometimes the whole term calling is only applied to ministry. But this is where the Puritans really recovered the idea of vocation that extends beyond ministry, and a calling. And when I say calling, I don't mean a mystical, the heavens opened and God spoke with a loud voice, thou shalt be an engineer. I'm not talking about that. But I do think there's a sense of calling where, those 4 criteria I just gave you, your giftings, your abilities, your desires, what other people saying about you, and the doors that the Lord opens for you. I think that's a sense of calling. Even as an engineer or a lawyer or a teacher or a mom. So I'm reluctant to just use the word calling for those who are called into full-time ministry. I think that's too narrow, and I think that kind of leads to that secular sacred distinction, which I don't think we see too much in Scripture. And I think this is where the Puritans were really helpful. They recovered the fact that all work is good and useful, and it's not just secular versus sacred work. So I'm not sure that's what you're getting at, but yeah, Kelly.
I'm just thinking, do you think sometimes when you're talking about someone who's incompetent or isn't doing their job well, the Lord has called them to this vocation, but then they didn't do their part. Like, they didn't go to the continuing ed, they didn't read the books, they didn't stay late, be mentored, whatever the thing is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
I think sometimes when we say, well, I'm just not cut out for this, they didn't really even put in the effort to see if they could do the thing.
That's right.
Now
you're into the territory of what makes a good worker. There's
Right.
diligence, there's humility, there's wholeheartedness, there's enthusiasm,
Teachability.
there's teachability, and now you're into what makes someone more effective in what they're doing, and all of that's a factor. Yeah, Benjamin.
I think kind of what you were saying earlier, of just our parents' generation of just working because that's what you did, and third world countries and kind of with calling and stuff. It's like, speaking from personal experience, 3 years ago I stepped out of aviation to do something different, or thinking I would, and yet when there comes a point when the expenses are adding up and everybody's staring at you, the man of the family, it's like, so what's next? It's like, at a certain point you'll do whatever it takes. And that's where I think that desperation that in a lot of other countries where you see in a third world country where people are not so privileged or spoiled, maybe we should say,
Yeah.
that I think you have closer to a better understanding really of just do something. And ultimately, I mean, for me it was like, okay, well, I have to do what I was trained in, and I just need to go where I can make the most money, and it really is not going to matter what it is.
Because you have obligations and responsibilities.
Right.
You have a wife, you have 6 children,
Right.
number 7 on the way,
Yep.
and there's some hungry mouths, and you
Exactly.
have to take care of them.
Yeah, and it's not always fun, being gone a lot and
Yeah.
strange hours, and
And then you get home and your kids are complaining. It's like, well, I hate doing the dishes. Like, I don't care what you hate. Let me tell you what I hate, but I'm not going to. But it's that mindset of just, suck it up, Buttercup. Just go do it.
Yeah.
Because that's all there is to it.
Exactly.
You just have to do it, and in doing that, you can glorify the Lord.
Absolutely.
Because you're proving yourself to be faithful. Like Colossians says, whatever you do your work heartily as for the Lord.
Correct.
Rather than for the men, because it's the Lord who's receiving the reward of the inheritance.
Exactly.
It's because you're serving Christ in it, and you're proving to be faithful. And the passage in Hebrews 12, that Jesus, went to the cross for the joy set before him. Yes, despising the shame. He didn't like the shame part of it.
Yeah.
He really despised it, but he did it because of the joy, knowing what would be accomplished through that work that he did.
Yeah.
And I think that example, at least for me, going back to that again and again and again, of I can do my small trial of whatever I'm experiencing today because of what Jesus did. And Peter says, he set an example for us.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's, yeah.
Gary?
I was just gonna add in, everything, if you listen to what everybody's saying, it's the intent. If you are a believer, you're not gonna be slothful, you're gonna read what you're supposed to read, you're gonna try hard.
Right.
Like she was talking about, that just because you're doing a computer job and you're trying to raise money, depends what's the intent of why you're raising the money. Like you were talking with the Puritans, somebody had to build the churches. And you wanted quality craftsmen to be able to do that.
Sure.
You wanted quality craftsmen to build a buggy you rode in to go to it.
Yeah.
All this is related. There again, it's all intent. What is your thought process and who do you believe in?
Exactly.
And if you're a non-believer, you're not gonna care about this stuff. You're gonna be trying to be rich and trying to get this. My dad had an old saying a long time ago, which I've followed until now. I've done this job, the one I do, for 35 years. But he said to me, even when I had a job, I was always looking for a new job.
Really?
And what the intent was there was, if you're not happy with what you're doing, there's another job out there if you look.
Sure.
If you quit looking, you're not gonna find it.
Sure.
So sometimes you don't know what you wanna do, and you gotta take something you do, but the way I look at it, and I think the Lord strives for this, if you're not doing what you like to do, that's probably not what your gifting is. So you need to keep finding what your gift is, and some people don't know what that is.
Sure.
I find people that are very blessed, like 16 years old, 15 years old, they know what they wanna do. They go to college, they get their degree, they know exactly, I find that amazing.
Yeah.
I didn't grow up until I was 32 years old to find what I wanna do. And I did all these things we're talking about. I had to work all kinds of jobs I hated.
Yeah.
And I wasn't a believer then, that's why I hated them. But as a believer, that's all changed in how I look at my career. I get frustrated. I just find it so funny that we're doing this, and we were talking earlier about my job. I didn't know we were gonna talk about work today.
Yeah, well, this is just for you.
Yeah.
No, just kidding.
But I
Terry.
mean, just because they work on a computer doesn't mean they're not doing their job.
Yeah, for
There's a lot
sure.
of ways to do that, so.
Yeah, Terry.
I think the bottom line that you were talking about is obedience.
Yeah.
It's obedience, and that obedience and that heart of obedience then takes you to the intentionality and takes you to the desire to fulfill the responsibilities, and the obedience takes you through the jobs that you don't like because you're being obedient.
Yeah. I mean, faithfulness would be
In
another
your
word.
heart, yes.
Yep.
He doesn't call us to love everything we do. He calls us to be faithful. So, are you being faithful? Yeah, got it.
How does this work, kind of going off of Lauren's point and a little bit of Kelly's point, within just general work within the church? Not necessarily spiritual gifting, but just when somebody shovels, somebody stacks chairs, decorating happens, and I gutter shoveler, then, I could study for hours and try and decorate, and it's not gonna come natural to me. How does that work, outside of the context of where we have to labor, you have to just put food on the table for your family? How does it work kind of in that setting?
Like spiritual gifts within the church?
Not necessarily spiritual gifts, but the giftedness, the talents, the bents that we have within just functioning in, that kind of work that you're doing.
Yeah. Well, clearly the Lord has given every believer a gift, and when each believer exercises their gifts, then the church is edified the way it should be. So that's the whole point of 1 Corinthians 12 is don't seek different gifts. However the Lord has put you together, you rejoice in that, and you go serve in those arenas that are fit for that gifting to the glory of Christ. And when you do that, the church becomes what God intends it to be. But if everyone's looking to be, the whatever, they're an eye and they want to be the foot, or their foot and they want to be the eye, if everyone's clamoring for that, then where's the foot and the eye? I mean, so everyone is unique, everyone is needed, and so we want to make sure that we value every single person and what they're contributing to the church, and it's all critically important. So is that what you're getting at, or are you getting at more of how you know what your giftings are?
No, I think it's kind of that, and just looking at, because do you spend a bunch of time trying to learn something, if you're just not naturally gifted in that, or do you just go, you know what, I can shovel snow and do it to the glory of God.
You shovel snow to the glory of God. Absolutely, and we are so thankful for clear, and she does, yeah, for clear steps. I'd say part of this is figuring out how God has put you together, right? So, I mean, the whole spiritual inventory, gift test, I'm not into those things. I'd say, what do you like to do? How has God built you? Start serving and see where he leads you. And I promise you, he will lead you into a place where you're suited for that, and the church needs someone to do that. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or not, but yeah, Jordan and Lauren together as a couple. This is
I was just gonna add to that of like I think with the work, and then whether call it like how you're made versus what you just like more of a duty mindset. I think both of those are elements that I think throughout your life there will be certain things that you just feel. I mean, take church, serving in the church. There are some things that like singing and being a worship team, that's something that comes very naturally for me and something I truly just enjoy doing.
Yeah.
I've served in the nursery and toddler room before. Not my favorite,
not your thing.
but there was a need, and I was able to do it.
Yeah.
So I think
Still a
sometimes
need.
I know, but but I'm just saying, like, I think sometimes there's a need, and you just do what's needed too,
Yeah.
like not because like, oh sorry, I don't do that. I think if there is a need and you have the resources to meet that need, I think you should try.
Yes.
While at the same time, I think you should also pursue what you are naturally gifted at. And I think the same thing goes for even work. Like, yeah, if you have the option, do something that you truly enjoy. But I think there is kind of a sense where we maybe downplay the aspect of duty and what is required of us, or maybe like what you were saying, like my family needs to be fed, and this is what I'm able to do, and this is the job I'm able to get. Then there might be a season where we've all had jobs where we're like, this is not
Of course.
something I'm really excited about, but what it's producing we can be excited about.
Absolutely.
Or what it's for.
I mean, you don't have to have the spiritual gift of setting up chairs to set up chairs. Everyone in this room could do that.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's a need for that, and you just need to go do it.
Right.
But at the same time, there are people who are more gifted in service, and that's an arena where they can thrive. So, yeah. Kelly?
I was just gonna piggyback and say, we've always told our kids, like, it's good to figure out what you like to do and to help that way, but there's an offering of your time too. And when the church needs something, maybe you don't wanna do the thing.
Yeah.
If it's a need, then we say, yeah, we can do that. So we've always told them, like, cause they say that stuff to us, like, well, I'm not good at that. I'm like, well, it's a need.
Someone needs to do
And
it.
you're
Yeah,
able.
yeah, you can move a chair, or you can,
Yeah.
but,
It's like the dishes.
yes,
It's
exactly.
done.
Yeah.
It just has to-
Yeah.
Somebody's got to do it.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, it's just, I've always
And I'll
believed
bring
that God
grandmother.
will bless the work of our hands.
Exactly.
And that if we're thankful and grateful and we do our work to honor the Lord, then that, not only will we be blessed, but our work will be blessed. And I think about third world nations that I've been to, and I've looked at these people, and it was always puzzling to me because in a lot of ways they're craftsmen, they're very good at what they do, and God is nowhere to be found. 99% say Buddhist, and 1% Christian, and that's Catholic. But yet you see just some amazing things, and there's no blessings.
Mm.
I mean, they're just destitute of blessings. They're like that they're world nations. But then I think that, you know, we beat that by honoring God.
Yeah.
And being thankful and grateful for the opportunities
Absolutely.
that we have.
Yep, absolutely. Which is what we're trying to get at in this whole topic tonight is it's not what you do, it's how you do it and who you honor. So that's really kind of the underlying theme here. Let me just hit a few more things here. On page 4, some other principles. Work was radically affected by the fall. So Gary, maybe you're the one that said this a moment ago. Yeah, it's work was good before the fall, and work is still good after the fall, but the fall complicates our work. And the difficulty of work came as a result of this fall. So you can see the effect of it on Adam. I mean, you could think about it on Eve. What was the effect on Eve? Well, now childbearing becomes laborious, no pun intended. The relationship between a man and a woman becomes strained. He wants to rule, she wants to rule over him, he is going to rule over her. Now Adam is told that you're going to have to work harder to get food from the ground, and there's going to be thorns and thistles, and you're going to have to work by the sweat of your brow. So clearly all of this is made more difficult by the presence of sin in our world. Very bottom of page 4, sin made everyone's job harder, and we can go through the list there. Excuse me. The tragic devastation cannot be overstated. So every time you're frustrated at work, every time there's conflict at work, every time work is difficult, every time the project doesn't go as you planned, every time there's a delay, every time there's another issue and you're frustrated at work, what's going on there? It's not the work itself, it's the effect of the fall upon that work. So clearly this has had a massive impact in all of our work. Top of page 5, a couple more principles. Work is to be done diligently. I'm not going to go through all of those proverbs, but you can see obviously how many times Proverbs and even Ecclesiastes talks about the importance of hard work and diligence and not being a sluggard and not being lazy. I love that Proverbs 6 picture of the ant. Go to the ant, O sluggard. Observe her ways. See what she does. And if you just watch an anthill, it is fascinating to see. You should do that sometime. If you've never done that, just go sit by an anthill and just watch what's going on. There is labor. There's a division of labor. There is working together, cooperation. It is a fascinating thing to watch. And they're examples of hard work, which is to me incredible. Solomon looks at one of the smallest creatures in the world and says, you learn from them.
Have you ever seen one sit down and relax?
No. I've never seen an ant relax. They are busy. No ant recliners.
They also don't sit around and ponder, is this my calling?
Well said, Jordan.
Yeah, I do feel like some of the things we're talking about is just kind of the hierarchy of needs. When we live a certain life, we have expectations for our work and even some of the fulfillment stuff. Just that people say, find a job you love and you'll never work a day in your life. Is that really true? You never have to. I mean, even if you have something that seemingly just perfectly fits, square peg, square hole, perfect job type thing, where you're like, this is exactly what I want to do. There's still going to be hard things
because the fall affects even that.
Because the fall affects that. If you're, and I think a lot of that's just rooted in discontentment. I mean, it's just you want what someone else has.
Right.
You want the success, the apparent ease, the insert thing here. We want what other people have, and
Correct.
so you don't see the ant looking over at the honeybee and saying, "Why can't I fly?"
Right.
Or they are in their role and they understand their role, and there's no. That is kind of a good, obviously a biblical example.
Right. So whatever the Lord's given you to do it wholeheartedly, diligently, with discipline and vigor and enthusiasm. And it doesn't mean you can't switch jobs, but whatever the Lord's given you to do it diligently. Look at Ecclesiastes 9:10. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. I love that. There's no activity or planning or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol where you're going. So whatever the Lord's given you to do, do it. Do it well. Do it hard work, and do it diligently. So that's a critical principle. Then next to that, or below that, work done without a view toward God is vanity. I wish we had time to really flesh this out in Ecclesiastes. It's one of my favorite books. Well, what's the whole point of Ecclesiastes? Do everything you do with a view toward God, and it will have meaning in your life. Do everything you do without an attitude toward God, it will be futile and empty and meaningless. So go do your work. Enjoy your work. God has not given that as just a chore. There's things you should enjoy about your work. And you shouldn't apologize for that. Enjoy the labor. Enjoy the fruit of your labors. Enjoy the finances that come with that and some of the blessings that come from that. Enjoy all of that. But, bottom of page 5, work done without God in view is empty, futile, and vain. So if you want to be pursuing empty, dead-end roads when it comes to your work, just do it as an end in itself. Don't think about God. Don't commit your work to the Lord. Don't pray about it. Don't do any of that. Just do your job without any consideration of God in that, and you will find it to be very futile and very empty. Right? So that's kind of the Ecclesiastes, what it's about. Top of page 6. Yeah, just a little bit more on that. Work is a source of joy and satisfaction when viewed from a biblical perspective. God is the one who brings meaning, satisfaction, and purpose to that which is by itself is meaningless and futile. So God is the big difference maker. We can turn work, which is futile and meaningless from a secular view, into a means by which we worship God and give him thanks. So it's just a matter of perspective. Do you see God in your work? Do you please him in your work? Do you do your work heartily as unto him? Then another principle, Jesus models a proper attitude toward work. It's just fascinating to me. Jesus worked for 30 years as a carpenter. Well, not all those years probably, but many of those years before he ever launched a public ministry. What does that tell you about our Savior? He worked a regular job. He made things. He was a carpenter. And so he shows us what work is like. And then when it comes to his ministry, he worked to accomplish the will that the Lord has given him. I love John 4:34. Jesus says, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work." So he knew he was on a divine mission. And he gave himself wholly and entirely to the point that it cost him his life. In fact, there were times he needed rest. In his ministry, we see that in Mark, where he couldn't even get a meal, and they needed to pull back and get some rest because he was so committed to the work that the Lord gave him to do. So we see Christ modeling a proper attitude toward work. And then bottom of page 6, it is the gospel that redeems work from its meaninglessness. So I wish we had time to go through these texts, but maybe we can just do this very briefly. We can, in a small way, reverse the curse of work by laboring according to God's power in his strength and for his glory. We are made into God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus, which I think includes even our work. Obviously, there's spiritual work going on there. He's sanctifying you, growing you, maturing you, making you more like Christ. But a part of that is your actual work, your vocation. And so the gospel revolutionizes how we view work, in that work becomes another opportunity to glorify God. So let's just do this. Let's look up a few of these key passages. Well, they're at the bottom of your notes. You don't need to turn to them. Pull out some of these principles here. Let's just very quickly say, okay, what does the New Testament tell us about how to work? So Ephesians 6, slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart, as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will render service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. I mean, you could spend a whole hours on that, but pull out some principles. What are some key things you see there in how we as believers need to approach our vocation in a way that honors the Lord? So what are some of the things you see there? Just list them.
Obedience.
Obedience. Be obedient. So part of the work the Lord's given you to do just requires obedience, like Terry just said. What else do you see in that text?
Sincerity of heart.
Sincerity of heart. So now we're talking about not mixed motives. We're talking about a pure heart. Lord, I want to please you. I want to honor you. He says the same thing in verse 6, doing the will of God from the heart. So the question I would pose to you is, what is your heart towards the work that the Lord has given you to do? Is it grumbling? Is it discontentment? Is it wishing you had another position? Is it mad at God that he's put you in this job? Or can you say, you know what, this is where the Lord has me right now, and I'm going to serve him faithfully with a pure heart? What else do you see in this text?
Live and work for an audience of one.
Good. You live and you work for an audience of one. Verse 6, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ. So who are you seeking to please? Ultimately, you're not seeking to please your boss. I mean, you're to honor him or her, but ultimately your service is not to them, it's to the Lord. He's watching, he knows, he sees. So, someone has said before in ministry, we preach or we minister to an audience of one. And the same principle applies to your job as well. You are to work to an audience of one. So, anything else you see in that passage?
Goodwill.
Okay, with goodwill, not with loathing or regret or despising it. What about the last part of verse 8? You will receive. Do you ever think about this? Work done well to the glory of God will bring you reward. It's okay to think about rewards in eternity. It's okay to know, you know what, this may not be the thing that I want to do most. This may not be the job that I'm most excited about, but you know what, I'm going to honor the Lord, and because of that, he's going to reward me. That's biblical. In fact, notice the next passage, Colossians 3, look at verse 24, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It's in the context of work. So it's okay to say, you know what, I just want to serve the Lord faithfully. And I don't care if I don't get the promotion. I don't care if maybe it's not the job that I want the most. There's going to be a reward for me someday knowing I did it well as unto the Lord. So does that cross your mind? Do you think about that? Do you work with a view towards eternity and towards reward? So we could spend a lot of time going through those texts, but look at just very quickly Colossians 3 at the bottom of page 6. You should do this in the name of the Lord. Maybe you just want to underline some of these. You should do it with an attitude of thankfulness. You should do it not with external service, as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart. You should fear the Lord. You should do your work heartily. Look at verse 23. Do your work heartily, because you're doing it for the Lord rather than for men. So, just these passages are so packed with principles. So, are you doing it to the Lord? Are you doing it with an attitude of thankfulness? Are you fearing him? Is your heart pure? And are you doing it heartily? Or is it just bare minimum, I'm going to skate by, and that's not honoring to the Lord? All right. So top of page 7, 1 Timothy 6 is another passage. Titus 2 is one of those key passages as well. Be subject to your masters in everything, to be well-pleasing. Just notice this list. Let me just ask you, is this true of you? Not argumentative, not pilfering. So first of all, not argumentative. You're not arguing, you're not disputing, you're not constantly questioning. Doesn't mean you can't say things like we could do this better, or can we talk about this? That doesn't mean you can't do that, but are you constantly arguing and fighting and trying to do it a different way just because you want to do it a different way? That's not a becoming of a believer. You're not pilfering. You're not stealing anything from anybody. You're not taking time, you're not taking possessions, you're not taking paper clips, pens, you're not stealing from your boss in any of those things. You're not stealing whatever else you could steal. You're not pilfering. You're showing all good faith. Why? Why should you work this way? Because you will adorn the doctrine of God, our Savior, in every respect. You make God look good when you work this way. When this is your attitude, this is how you approach your work, you actually adorn. I think the word is cosmeo, which is where we get our word cosmetic. So ladies, you put all the cosmetics on, you look wonderful, and it just looks great. Well, that's the idea. You're making God look great when you work like this. That's why I said earlier, I think believers ought to be the best employees in any corporation or any place wherever you're laboring, because it's not ultimately about you. You want to make God look good in every respect. So this is where the Puritans were really helpful. We don't have a ton of time here to think about this, but this is where the Protestant reformers really help us understand this. I would encourage you maybe to spend some time thinking about the Puritan work ethic and what happened as a result of the Reformation in the 1500s. Prior to that, there was a major secular sacred distinction. In fact, the only people in that medieval Middle Age culture that were viewed as being really valuable to the Lord were those that were doing the ministry, the priests, and those working in churches. And if you didn't have a church-related position, well, it was just, you just got to do it. There's no value to what you do. So there was this major distinction between those two. And this is where the Puritans came back and said, no, they totally erased that distinction. So notice number one there, they accomplished this by emphasizing the sanctity of all legitimate types of work. They did away with a secular sacred distinction. Notice this quote here: the rejection of this dichotomy renders every task of intrinsic value and integrates every vocation with a Christian spiritual life. It makes every job consequential by making it the arena for glorifying and obeying God and for expressing one's love through service to one's neighbor. The Puritan conviction about the dignity of all work also has the important effect of sanctifying the common. I love that. Sanctifying the common. For the Puritans, all of life was God's. Their goal was to integrate their daily work with their religious devotion to God. It doesn't matter what you do. If you work a factory job, God can sanctify the common because you do it as unto Him with the right attitude in a way that pleases Him. So there's no sacred secular distinction anymore. That dichotomy has been done away. We don't believe there should be that. So let me just make it practical. I don't believe that what I do is more important than any of what you do. I mean, I get to stand in front of people and proclaim the word. That is a massive privilege, and I'm so thankful for it, and I never take that for granted. But at the same time, it's not more important than what you do. Your work is kingdom work. Your labor is done, when done with the right attitude, contributes to the kingdom. And even if it seems like a dead-end, nothing job, if you do it to the Lord, it's not. Right? So that's the beauty of this whole understanding of work. And then number two, what they did is this idea of calling to a vocation. I mentioned this a little bit before. They taught that God calls every person to his or her vocation. Every Christian, said the Puritans, has a calling. To follow it is to obey God. The important effect of this attitude is that it makes work a response to God. One effect of this is to make the worker a steward who serves God. God, in fact, is the one who assigns people to their tasks. In this view, work ceases to be impersonal. Moreover, its importance does not lie within itself. This is very important. Work is rather a means by which a person lives out his or her personal relationship with God. To work in one's calling, in the Puritan view, is to work in the sight of God. So you can see how this attitude revolutionizes. As it says there, it leads to contentment in your work, and it leads to a loyalty to that calling, believing it was neither entered into or abandoned lightly. So you see how this understanding just reshapes the way we think about labor, work, vocation, jobs, etc.? Notice one example of this, the bottom of page 7. Granted, the professions were limited in the 1500s, but doctors, lawyers, merchants, they were all vocations and callings. Luther applied vocation to the work of the peasant class, to the farmers and servants. To Luther, all work and all roles we play were potentially holy callings, which could be fulfilled for the glory of God alone. A few generations later, Johann Sebastian Bach illustrated this perfectly. Whether Bach was writing music commissioned by and for the church, or whether it was for other purposes, he signed all of his music with his 2 initials and those 3 letters, SDG, Soli Deo Gloria. So even when he was writing, non-Christian music, he was doing it to the glory of God. So all work is a calling, and we can glorify God at work. So, thoughts on this? Dan?
Well, question, how do you see the words work and worship relating? Is work one part of the category of worship?
Absolutely. I would say all of life is worship, right? This is Romans 12:1 and 2. By the mercies of God, I urge you to present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice to the Lord, a spiritual service of worship. So I would say everything that we do in this life is meant to be an act of worship. It's not what we do from 9:30 to 11, or those were our old times, 8:30 to 10 and 10:30 to 12. That's not just the times of worship. Worship is what you do in your job. It's what you do with your time. It's how you spend your money. It's how you serve other people. It's how you raise your kids. It's your attitude toward everything in life. So I think work is a subset of worship, or it should be at least. So thoughts on that? Agree?
Yeah.
Disagree? Yeah.
I remember the word worship, it can also mean serve. If I remember, I think it's Latruo or something.
Latruo, yeah. Yeah, worship is, service is a way of worship. And it's actually a word that was used in the temple, or to refer to the work that was done in the temple. Those Levites and priests were serving, and in doing so, they were worshiping. Yeah. So your work is an avenue to worship. Okay. A couple more principles, and then we'll wrap up here. Page 8. Another principle is failure to work brings consequences. Ephesians 4. He who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with one who has need. I had a conversation with one of my kids last week, and I said, I was trying to get at the whole put off, put on thing in Scripture, and I said, when does a thief stop being a thief? And this child says, when they stop stealing. And I said, no, that's not right. When does a thief stop being a thief? When they start working and giving to others. And so, if you don't work, you're not performing the labor that the Lord has given you to do. So it's not enough to just stop stealing. You have to work hard, and so you can give to others. 1 Thessalonians 4 says, work with your hands and make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. 2 Thessalonians 3:10, you know this, if anyone is not willing to work, then he's not to eat either. So, this is one of those texts where you have to wrestle with when you see the panhandlers downtown, and it's so hard to know. I have to believe there's some really legitimate needs there, but at the same time, if you're not willing to work, Scripture says you shouldn't eat. So you work, you labor, so that you can reap the benefits of that. So there's a danger in not working. And then lastly, as I said, there will be work in the eternal state. And you say, what kind of work? Notice Revelation 22:5, the last phrase, they will reign forever and ever. Reigning is working. There will be work involved in reigning. You're not just going to sit on a throne and you just get to, have everything brought to you. No, reigning involves working. There's leading, there's organizing, there's planning, there's executing. So we will be working in the kingdom. So there you have it, some principles on work. Page 9, just some very practical implications then. What does all this mean? You should work hard. You should work enthusiastically. You should give your whole heart to it. And you should work with excellence. So do you do what you do with excellence? Is it just slipshod, half-hearted, barely getting by, or are you giving your best and doing what you do with excellence? So, thoughts on any of this stuff? Last minutes here before we wrap up.
I feel like on just that Ephesians 6 passage, there's just a new metric for success in work. It's not, a work in sales, so there's an element where your success or lack thereof is very clear. It's very, it's posted, the numbers are posted for the whole company, how good, how well or poorly you're doing. And as a believer in any given profession, your level of success is not determined by how much you sell or how it is are you doing the things necessary? Are you actually being obedient and faithful to do the things that God's called you to do, regardless of the outcome?
Right.
And I think God will bless that if you're doing the hard thing and you're showing up and you're being consistent. There will be blessing in that, but the metric ultimately isn't praise from others or promotions or things like that. The metric for success is God pleased with me, and then there's eternal blessings that come from that and reward. So there's definitely a mindset shift of I'm not hitting my numbers this month, God must be mad at me type of mindset. And I think sometimes even we can think like that, even if we don't claim we're not health, wealth, prosperity type people. We can practically be when we expect, we put in this, God must give us human earthly success, and that's not always the case. Sometimes there's difficulties, sometimes there's pruning, sometimes there's patience and endurance that has to be built up. That God's more concerned about those things than the oftentimes fear of man stuff that may drive us when it comes to success in other people's eyes.
And it's a challenge because we live in a culture that thinks that way. Success is numbers, products, sales, money, and so you just have to do nothing and just get sucked into that. So you actually have to consciously, I think, retrain our thinking. So, all right, thank you so much. See you in 3 weeks. No class the next 2 weeks. I'll see you Sunday.
See you through.